Hello, in this video, I'm going to explain aggregate demand and then discuss why aggregate demand curve slopes downward. And finally, I will also talk about factors that shift aggregate demand curve either to the right or to the left. So by aggregate demand, I mean overall demand, total demand in the economy. Buyers collectively buy goods and services at each possible price level. So basically, there are four components of aggregate demand. And these components are capital C as consumption expenditures, IG is gross investment, capital G is government expenditures, and XN simply means net exports, that is exports minus imports. So these are four categories for demand. Consumption expenditures mean when consumer demand consumer goods and services. By net exports, I mean when foreigners are demanding our products. But we have to subtract imports because that is not the demand for the goods and services that are produced within a country. So basically, there are four types of buyers: consumers, investors, government, and foreigners. And these four types of buyers would demand our goods and services. We know that there is a negative relationship between the price index and real GDP, that is total demand in the economy. Let me show you aggregate demand curve. So this is the downward sloping aggregate demand curve, whereas we have taken real GDP on the horizontal axis and price level or GDP deflator. This is a price index on the vertical axis. By GDP deflator, I mean the price index of all goods and services produced in a country. And it is calculated as the ratio of nominal GDP and real GDP times 100. Now, why does aggregate demand slope downward? There are three main reasons that are given on this screen. Number one is what we call real balances effect. That is, when price index increases, it will decrease the real wealth of consumers because they can't afford to buy because of higher prices. And this will lead to a decrease in consumption expenditures. Consumption expenditures are one component of aggregate demand. So aggregate demand will decrease because of increase in price index. And this is because of this effect, that is real balances effect. The other reason is interest rate effect. So when we have higher price index, commercial banks and other lending institutions are going to charge investors and consumers, in general, borrowers, a higher interest rate in order to compensate higher prices or inflation premium. This increase in interest rate will discourage investment expenditures. Investors are not going to borrow at higher cost to make investment, and therefore investment will fall. So when investment decreases, it means that aggregate demand is decreasing because investment is another component of aggregate demand curve. The third reason is foreign purchases effect. That is, when we have higher price index or when price increases for all goods and services together, then the country will not be able to export more because foreigners are not going to buy our product because these products are becoming more expensive. So exports will decrease and imports of the same country will increase because if prices are soaring domestically, then it is more viable to buy goods and services that are cheaper outside that country. So the net effect is that on the one hand, exports are decreasing, on the other hand, imports are increasing. So net exports must also be decreasing, which is another component of aggregate demand. So all these three effects simply tell us that when price index increases, aggregate demand will decrease. Remember, this decrease in aggregate demand is because of the price level, because of the changes in the price index. So there's a movement along the same demand curve. In the next slide, I will determine or discuss the determinants of aggregate demand. By determinants of aggregate demand, I mean that I'm going to discuss factors that will shift aggregate demand curve, the whole curve, either to the right or to the left. So it is possible that without changing prices, if any of these components of the aggregate demand curve is increasing or decreasing, then AD curve will shift either to the right or to the left. So this is the diagram that shows a rightward shift in aggregate demand curve from AD1 to AD2. And aggregate demand shifts to the right when any of the four components increases. So for example, increase in consumption expenditures, increase in investment expenditures, increase in government expenditures, and increase in net exports. All these four factors will shift the aggregate demand to the right. But remember that increase in C, consumption expenditure, is not because of the real balances effect, is not because of the changes in the price index. Suppose there's no change in price index. At the same price level, now consumers are buying more. Why they are buying more? There's so many reasons. Maybe because their wealth has gone up, maybe because of lower personal taxes. There's so many reasons why consumers consume more, not because of price, but because of other factors. Similarly, investment. Investment, yes, will decrease or increase depending on the price index. But investment will also be determined by other factors. For example, expectations about business conditions. So if you are an investor and if you expect that the conditions are going to improve 6 months or a year down the road, then investors are going to invest more. It has nothing to do with interest rates or price index. So if all these four components are increasing, not because of the price index, but because of some other factors, which are mentioned here in this slide, then aggregate demand curve shifts rightward. Similarly, if consumption expenditures are decreasing, investment expenditures are decreasing, government expenditures are decreasing, and exports are decreasing, or net exports are decreasing, then aggregate demand curve will shift to the left, which is not shown here in this slide. Notice that number 3 is very important. So government can also shift aggregate demand curve either to the right or to the left. Government will or can increase its own expenditures or can lower taxes to allow consumers to purchase more, and therefore shifting the aggregate demand to the right. Similarly, government can also decrease its own expenditures or increase taxes to shift the aggregate demand curve to the left. So that's all as far as aggregate demand curve, the slope of the aggregate demand curve, and shifting of aggregate demand curve are concerned. Thank you.